Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah Cooperman, and I am the Chief Symposium Editor at the Criminal Justice Law Review here at UCLA. We are so excited to have you all here for our annual symposium. We worked really hard to bring a lot of distinct voices to the table, and we hope that this can be the first step of many in discussing restorative justice more broadly and in law school and beyond. As UCLA, the Criminal Justice Program and the Criminal Justice Law Review are the hosts of this event. We also would like to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino/Tongva peoples. We are thrilled to have so many amazing panelists speaking with us about their experiences working with and about their perspectives on restorative justice, and we cannot wait to share all of this with you. In this conversation, we are discussing restorative justice as an alternative to the criminal justice system. We'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, UCLA School of Law's Public Interest in Policy Program, the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA School of Law, the South Carolina Restorative Justice Initiative, the Center on Negotiation and Mediation at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, and the Aoki Center for Critical Race and Nation Studies at UC Davis. Now we'd like to introduce our moderator, Jenny Poretz, a second-year law student at UCLA in both the Public Interest and Critical Race Studies programs.
Thank you so much, Hannah, and thank you to our incredible panelists and to everyone who's joining us. I'm very excited to be having this conversation with you all. So on Wednesday's panel, we learned about restorative justice as a practice and as a way of life. I've been taught that restorative justice is fundamentally about relationships, how we create them, sustain them, and mend them. And it's based on this idea that we're all deeply interconnected, and so a harm to one is a harm to all. In this way, restorative justice calls us to a paradigm shift in the way that we think about and respond to harm, moving away from an individualistic, punitive response to one rooted in community, in accountability, and in healing, with an eye towards structural violence. Our currently 3 incredible panelists, we're hoping to have one more join us, Iri Mako, but currently Wakumi Douglas, Ghani Songster, and Jennifer Llewellyn, can provide us with insight on how this paradigm shift is being implemented across the globe as a response to harm and violence in place of our current criminal punishment system. And you can see their bios in the chat. And so while there are nuances to each program and how they're implemented, since this is only a 1-hour panel and we can't really get into the nitty-gritty of each program, I'm going to be doing a brief overview of what these processes tend to look like. So these processes that are often referred to as family group conferences, restorative community conferences, or more broadly as restorative justice diversion programs, often share a baseline framework where a young person has caused harm, and rather than going through the traditional legal process of being charged and sentenced, the case is diverted to a community-based organization that facilitates a restorative justice process, which ultimately brings the young person who caused the harm, their caregivers, the community, the person they harmed, and their supporters together to share what happened, take accountability, and come up with a plan for the young person to repair the harm. These processes are facilitated by the very people on this panel and can happen at many different stages of the legal process: pre-arrest, pre-charge, post-charge. For some of these programs, when the process is complete, the case will be closed and the charges are dropped. And so in shifting the way that harm and healing is addressed, these programs seem very much in opposition to our current punitive legal system, yet they still operate within the legal system and still maintain a level of closeness with state actors like the district attorney's office, who is often a referring agency to these community-based programs. So this is a tension that we're hoping to explore today in today's panel. But before we jump right in the spirit of restorative justice and in the spirit of relationship building, I wanted to have our panelists start with a more grounding question. And so I'm curious, you all, to hear more about like what this work means to you. And that can look like, why do you do this work? What do you bring with you to this work? And so let's start with Wakumi and then go to Ghani and then Jennifer.
Sure. Thanks, Jenny. It's really great to be with you all. Thank you to all of the folks who are joining us for this really important conversation, and to all of the hosts and sponsors and folk who made this happen. I come to this work as a survivor and as a person who's currently surviving the legal system, having done 33 years on the outside with my father, and I'm currently doing time on the outside with loved ones who are inside right now. And so my work, my relationship to this work is deeply personal. My relationship to this work is also deeply ancestral. My people are Maroon Africans who fled captivity on the island of Jamaica and fought for their freedom and were never enslaved. And so my people have always been freedom fighters and folks who sought liberation. And to me, this work is freedom fighting work. As we all know, the similarities between the current punishment system and enslavement and Jim Crow and all of that are very interconnected. And so this work around restorative justice, finding pathways for our people out of these systems and creating more healing rooted ways to attend to harm is absolutely freedom fighting work. And so I come to this work ancestrally as a freedom fighter, which that's in my bloodline. And I think I also come to this work as someone who really just truly believes that we can do better. We don't have to be doing it this way. And holding humanity to a higher standard for how we treat one another, and also, how we treat the planet. And so I think that's how I would answer the question. I'm excited to get to be in the conversation. I, by training, am a social worker. I'm a Black social worker, a community organizer, and I'm a deeply spiritual person, and I bring all of those skills and gifts and ways of being into our work.
Me? Okay. Peace and light to everyone here today. It's an honor and a blessing to be with you. What I bring to this work might not be any particular expertise. I probably bring a perspective from what I've witnessed and experienced as a person who've caused harm myself as a child and did 30 years in prison for that harm. On a sentence to life without parole. I know what it's like to give myself to selfish, wayward, and puerile and destructive pursuits. I know what it's like to plunge myself deliberately into dangerous situations, trying to get street cred, trying to overcompensate for inadequacies in myself as a young person. I ran away from home at 15 years of age, a week before completing the 9th grade, 250 miles away from my home in Brooklyn, New York, to Philadelphia. Joined unsavory company, a gang, if you will, sold drugs from fortified row homes with other runaway children, and then eventually committed the ultimate trespass months after I ran away. That is participating in the taking of a human life. Another runaway child in the organization. I was 15, he was 17. So I know what it's like to, in some ways, see causing harm and even death as a rite of passage, right? I bring that perspective to this work. I believe that healing justice work is not exclusively the responsibility of any one segment of this society. We all bear the responsibility of making our families, our communities, our planet life, for making life more livable and safe and healthy for everybody. And people who caused harm, like myself, right, not only bear a great responsibility for addressing and reducing harm, right, but can be very effective in communicating the value and power of accountability, right, and vulnerability to others who've caused harm or might be thinking about causing harm, right? Someone who has caused harm might relate to someone else who's caused harm more than they can relate to someone who hasn't. With the Young People in Healing Futures, which is our diversion program, our facilitators are youth organizers who are formerly incarcerated, formerly adjudicated young people, right? And informally incarcerated. And we were all responsible for some kind of harm. We all did time, and so we don't want that to define us. We're more than what we were sent to jail or prison for. Still, we often find it necessary to let young people know, look, we're not the cops. We're not the system. we caused harm too. So we're not here to judge you. How can we? We're here to let you know that you can make things right, right? Then I personally let them know about my situation. And I let them know, look, you didn't commit, no, what you did is not the moral equivalent of what I did. Be happy you didn't commit what I did. What I did is irreversible and irreparable, right? You can fix what you did, right? There's no fixing what I did. So if you can fix it, you should, because you don't want something more serious to be tied to you forever, right? And that's very effective, right? So that's what I bring. You know, I bring to this work a burning sense of responsibility, right, and accountability, an example that transformation is necessary and is possible, right, and that redemption is a part of healing, right, and redeeming justice is a part of restorative or transformative justice. And what is abolition but the thrust to redeem our humanity, and in the case of people who've caused harm, our moral rectitude.
I'm so incredibly humbled and honored to have been invited into this conversation and on a panel with such incredible depth of knowledge and expertise. I come to this work, I'm here in Nova Scotia, Canada, on Mi'kma'ki, on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And I've come into this work in restorative justice, I guess, from a sense of deep responsibility to think about what my responsibilities are as a settler here, and alongside and in relationship with those who've been systemically harmed by both historic injustices, and so have done that work for a long time, trying to find ways and spaces to be helpful and useful and carry some of the burden alongside those who have been incredibly privileged to be in relationship, whether they've been the survivors of the Indian residential school system here in Canada, those who have survived institutional abuse in the home for colored children here in my own province, or those who travel entrapped by the criminal justice system that has brought so much more harm than it seems to heal. And so I think I come to this work with a strong conviction as I work with students at the law school, or more broadly in the community, that we need to find ways that law is in service of justice, and places and spaces where we can pursue that work, as Jenny so eloquently described it, which is how I identify this work of restorative justice as about fundamentally seeing our need to be committed to just relations with one another, and all that would require of us individually and collectively. And that drives me to see this work as central to both what I'm called to do as a human being, and how I can make any contribution or difference to that in my professional life.
Edie, we're talking about what this work means to you. We're so grateful that you were able to join us. Thank you for being here, if you feel comfortable sharing that.
Morena tātou. Apologies for my late arrival. I'm calling in from Auckland, New Zealand, and my time difference was all out of whack. So I really apologize for joining this panel so late. But tēnā tātou, he uri ahau no Ngāti Rangi sihi me ngā ruahine rangi, he kua hau tētahi o ngā kaimahi o te whānau o Waipareira, ko Iri Mako tōku ingoa. Kia ora, that is how we introduce ourselves. I'm from Ngā Ruahine Rangi and Ngāti Rangitihi tribes, and I am working for Te Whānau o Waipareira, which is a large kaupapa Māori or Māori organisation that serves our community here in West Auckland. I restorative practices for me, I'm just listening. I'm sorry, I caught the last bit of Kempis and Jennifer's kōrero, their reasons why. And for we have a long history of colonization here in Aotearoa. And so that's actually what drives me, is that through that colonization, we are overrepresented, the Indigenous people, Māori of this country are overrepresented in the justice sector. And so part of my why is that there's no reason for us to be, and we need to be restoring our relationships with our own land and whenua, because that's, our evidence shows that the disconnect with our own culture and the disconnection with our land is one of the driving factors behind our huge overrepresentation and the statistics as they are today. So that's what I'm there for, is it's to address the racism, the underlying racism that is affecting our rangatahi or our youth, and also our families in general. Kia ora.
Thank you so much. And thank you all so much for sharing so vulnerably and truthfully. That was really powerful to bear witness to. I really appreciate it. Edie, if we can turn to you really quickly, you started to talk about, New Zealand's pretty unique history with colonization and restorative justice as a response to that. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, just give us a brief sort of history of New Zealand's unique history with restorative justice and its institutionalization. And if you can, tell us your thoughts on institutionalizing Indigenous practices and, any concerns, surprises, fears, or lessons that you learned about ways to move forward in right relationship.
Sure, just on that first part around our unique history, I don't think it's unique as Indigenous people, that it's unique just to Aotearoa or to New Zealand. Anywhere where colonisation has occurred, there will be very similar outcomes from that. So I'll only talk about my experience here in Aotearoa as a Māori woman. So restorative justice as it currently is, started in our community sector and with a lot of church communities, before it became kind of an in thing, it was an ad hoc type process or system, and it really was, if I'm talking about the justice sector, it really was at the whim of a judge and also at lawyers representing people who are coming through the justice sector. So if somebody requested it, they could get it. They could go through a restorative justice process. But for Māori, that wasn't how we used to restore things or resolve issues. So the institutionalization of Indigenous restorative practices, from our point of view, can be dangerous, because there's a tendency to pick and choose the parts of that Indigenous practice that suit the current legal framework or the policy, and the practice then becomes quite rigid in how you can address or what restorative practice can look like. So as a restorative practice facilitator, we have really good guidelines that the Ministry of Justice have put in place, and some very good training and I guess some skill-based training that practitioners can take away. My concern is when we start using frameworks, Māori frameworks, to overlay that or start to incorporate that, you can really miss the whole philosophy behind that particular practice or why we did those things before. And if I use example, we use what's called a pōwhiri, or whakatau, where you welcome in both parties into, so it could be those who have caused harm and those who have been harmed, and you'd welcome them into a space which makes it kind of neutral for them both. But in that practice, there's actually a lot of safety and that's already in that Indigenous practice that makes sure that everybody is safe in there, that everyone will be heard, and what we call that no one leaves feeling worse than how they came in, and that everybody's mana remains intact. So there is that school of thought in restorative justice, and maybe in the rest of the world as well, where the offender or the person who's caused the harm has done it simply to cause harm to that person without looking at what's happened in the background. And so for Māori, there's always this thing around, okay, well, what has happened for both of those people outside of this context as well of that interaction or engagement that they had. And with some of the practices we see there, of the utilization of our Indigenous practices, that doesn't fully get explored. And so I'm just thinking, it's quite hard to articulate. I want you all to come to New Zealand so you can see how it happens in practice. But the fact that it's very difficult if you're going to cherry pick bits and pieces of Indigenous practice and then say, oh, this will work, and then also put in Western ideas to try and make it a stronger practice. I think it's not helpful to anybody who's involved in that process, because neither one of them has, well, certainly my experience has been that the Western practice becomes the practice, and the one that the standard that the other practice, Indigenous practice, has to meet, but they want to put them both together. So my concern is that when that occurs, the people who we're meant to be serving or working with to help resolve anything or restore, it doesn't work as easily for them.
Thank you so much. I mean, do any of the, I want this to be more of a fluid conversation. So if things come up as folks are answering, feel free to jump in and respond and not just wait for me to ask you a directed question. So if folks want to respond, I'll give some space for that.
I was just going to say how deeply that resonates with, I know that to be the experience around the risk of institutionalization. And that spoke to me in two ways. One is that's a broader risk, I think, and I suspect we'll see that through our conversation today about the ways in which we don't want to watch restorative justice itself institutionalized in a way that captures it in service of the current system, right? And I think the Maori voice has been so strong in New Zealand about its critique of that happening around family group decision making and also within the criminal justice system, that there's something really instructive about that. Here in Canada, I think we see the same thing in terms of the concern of restorative justice capturing and limiting our understanding of Indigenous justice ways and law ways that are much more capacious, much more broadly situated in world traditions than the sort of piece that you described that gets pulled. And I'm always compelled by the Indigenous idea here of the Turo Wampum Belt, which speaks to our commitment to one another in treaty relationship here around traveling as vessels in the same stream, but not swamping one another, and figuring that that way of traveling in a reconciling way, in a supportive way, without ignoring the strong, in our context here in Canada, the strong role that has to be recognized in terms of Indigenous justice being self-governing and self-determining and not in service of the current system. And so it just resonates so deeply about the dangers and the real possibilities of restorative justice in terms of figuring out that how do we travel in allied and supportive ways that can be transformative.
So Ghani and Wakumi, and whoever feels, called to speak to this first, but I think in that vein, I'm curious to see how you both see restorative justice as being something that can be in service of abolition, knowing that it's still operating within like oppressive structures. And I think what are ways, if at all, that you're navigating restorative justice being co-opted and used as another tool to harm, sort of similar to what Iri was talking about, but also in the ways that we've seen probation, the way that it started out and to where it is now, be used as a tool to further institutionalize harm. And then I guess what then success looks like or means to you all in this system.
Kumi, you want to go?
I opened the session, so I'm happy to allow you to go and I'll follow up.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for that question. 'Cause I think it's important for us to remember some things when we take a dive into the question of the relationship between restorative justice and abolition. Among some of the things not to lose sight of is that abolition is generative, not destructive, right? And it's not just about tearing things down, right? It's about what we want to create in our world to make life more livable for everyone, right? It's also about freedom, right? From as far back as slavery times, abolition has been about freedom, redemption, restoration, transformation of humanity, right? Freedom for people to have full human development, all the things that restorative justice is about. It's also important to remember not just the roots of what we call restorative justice, but also the range of those roots, right? In so doing, we'll realize that what we call restorative justice shares some of the same roots as abolition, right? For instance, we know that restorative justice is rooted in indigenous principles, philosophies, practices, and ways of living and being, right? Did we know that restorative justice also has roots in the Black church, right? Roots in spirituality, period, right? And I love how my comrades, Joshua Doubler and Vince Lloyd, put it in their powerful book, Break Every Yoke, Religion, Justice, and the Abolition of Prisons, right? Saying that, quote, the frameworks and practices of restorative and transformative justice furnish pivotal tools in the abolitionist arsenal, right? But at the same time, how restorative justice is often appropriated by professionals and reformists today, right? And in how, these more secularist and bureaucratized iterations, right, of restorative justice, it represses the abolitionist spirit in the work. And we're very, very conscious of that, right? What we do, we know that we're about, facilitating healing after harm and so on and so forth, but we also don't lose sight of the larger cycles at work. Don't lose sight of the hands that's rocking the cradles of our young people, right? That's creating violent tendencies in our young people in our communities, right? And we take special care not to allow restorative justice to become like this new holistic tool for fixing our children, right? Because we don't believe that our children need fixing. What needs to be fixed is the world that they're being born into, right? And raised in. And we also aware that even though we use the term restorative justice and we wear it as titles and we operate under these official capacities, as restorative justice facilitator, and can you still hear me? Okay. We understand the limitations of the term, right? We know that restorative justice, the way it has been defined, doesn't address, let's say, traumas and addiction and poverty, right? It doesn't address, for instance, racism, gentrification, or what's should be more aptly called ethnic displacement, right? And so it's these macro issues that we need to address that's creating violent tendencies, that's perpetuating cycles of violence that we have to address, right? And so there has to be a transformative or abolitionist or revolutionary to be quite frank, you know what I'm saying, aspect to this work that we do. And it is, and we don't lose sight of that. We know that this is just a step to the grand vision, right? And it's a prefigurative step. And we focus on that prefigurative piece, right? Which is the direct action cited at the point of assumption, as they would say, where beliefs are made and unmade and the limits of the possible can be stretched, right? The goal of prefigurative intervention, right, is two things: to offer a compelling glimpse of what's possible, right, and a better future, but also to point up the poverty of imagination in the world that we live in and the systems that we have to deal with. You dig what I'm saying? And so like that piece about prefigurative actually creating models that give us a glimpse of the type of world, the type of justice that we want to see is important, right? Kind of like R. Buckminster Fuller, the late architect and inventor of the late 1800s, early 1900s, said, you don't change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that renders the existing model obsolete. And so it's important, you know what I'm saying, for us to do this work and model, you know, what we want to see and how we want to live. You understand what I'm saying? For all the reasons aforementioned, right? And so it's definitely a part of, it's definitely a step and a tool in the abolitionist toolkit. Now, and I would add only this, right? Since my sister here, Wakumi, brought up the Maroons, right? Because this was a part of my orientation in prison. And I want to lift this up too, and I don't mean to sound discursive, but my thoughts is running wild. It has been my experience, right? It has been my experience. I just want to lift this up, right? That all rivers lead to the ocean. So to those restorative justice professionals, and I'm speaking from experience here, right? But those restorative justice friends who don't hesitate to let you know how professionally trained they are in restorative justice and circle processes as a way to sort of establish rank, right? And put other people in their places who might not have degrees in restorative justice, right? And, you know, for whatever reason, right? But I want to touch on this because the tributaries that led me to the ocean of restorative justice or transformative justice work is not the same as the tributaries. I didn't get mines in academy or degrees. I got mines in the dungeons of prison, right? I entered restorative justice through more organic processes, right? Through a Black radical tradition, right? Which found its roots in the Black church, you understand, which was the incubator of radical politics in this country, as quiet as it's kept. And speaking of going back to the piece about Maroon, Maroons were those ancestors who, and by the way, in the American context, there were Maroons all over the Western Hemisphere. There weren't only Black Maroons too, there were also Indian Maroons, and there were white Maroons. They formed coalitions for the in the dismal Maroon Swamp Wars. But Maroons were those that broke away and fled to inhospitable areas, whether it was mountains or rainforests or palm forests or swamps, and set up communities, liberated communities, and resisted the plantocracy. And that form of resistance became known as Marinage, which is a spectrum of resistance from petite Marinage to grand Marinage. Marinage as a politics, right, doesn't hold the state's feet to the fire, at least not in the hopes that the state will one day get better. It doesn't think or hope that the state is going to improve. So it's a fundamental pessimism, not about what we have the capacity to do when we work together as a community, but a fundamental pessimism or lack of faith in the state's capacity to change fundamentally, right? And so we operate with that consciousness in mind. We have to deal with these referring agencies like the district attorney's office and all of that, probation offices and courts, right? But we understand that that's because they have all the cases and this is the dominant system in power. But we work for the day when we can be free of that, because we're still confined to the state's definition of how these cases are dealt with in terms of who's an offender and who's offended. Sometimes it might be mutual harm and it needs to be apologies on both sides. But we're still confined to this thing where one person has to apologize and one person has to be apologized to. And you know what I'm saying? And so we recognize that. And so we navigate that way the best that we could. And far as what success looks like for us in the final analysis, the success looks like when we can do this work without cases being referred to, when the district attorney's office and the courts, when they no longer have all the cases, when they're no longer the referring agency, and when we have finally done away with this, right? And we really realize community power, right? That's when we realize success. But I just want to lift that up, that and this is a fundamental pessimism that is not one that has us dejected or lacking hope, but one that we can walk down the street whistling a happy tune, that we have finally awoken to our potential when we work together, right? Our ability to arbitrate our own disputes and work out our own trespasses against each other.
Well, not a lot was left unsaid, which I've been in space with the dear brother Ghani before, and the brilliance of the way you think about our movement. It really is such a privilege and an honor to bear witness to, and to receive. What I would add, highlight, or pull out from what I heard is, one, in terms of the relationship between restorative justice and abolition, this, abolition requires an entire ecosystem of interventions that requires a multitude of interventions. Interventions that involve the state, interventions that don't, interventions in the streets, direct actions, organizing, policy, legal work. I mean, there is youth development, there's domestic violence work, there's all kinds of work that is required in order for us to achieve abolition. And so I think what we want to stay away from as folks who care about abolition is demonizing each other's work, putting each other's work down, devaluing it as if it's not all a part of, like Ghani said, rivers leading to oceans. We have to understand that there are lots and lots of different roles to play here, and all of them are important. I think about the Underground Railroad as a metaphor for this. Everyone who was a part of the Underground Railroad had a very different type of role. From like lighting the lantern so people knew they could come, to feeding people, to, transporting people, to setting up and orchestrating the whole thing. So there's so many different things that have to happen to get our people to freedom. And so my perspective on it is, and then also I think, we've had like 400 years of this horrifying shit, 400, more than that even, potentially. It's gonna take us time. We have to understand, we have to give ourselves grace and we have to understand that it's going to take us time, and we're going to make mistakes, and there are going to be harms that happen as we attempt to get to freedom. There are going to be harms, and then we get to contend with those and learn the lesson and get wiser and get sharper and get better and keep it moving. So that's my sort of mentality on my way of thinking about this. I think, I also wrote down contracts and relationships, and my work with Soul Sisters Leadership Collective, it took us 2 years to get the state to trust us and for us to build a contract with the state that we were comfortable with in order to go forward and receive referrals. By the way, now we're probably closer to 3 years because of the pandemic. It took time. It took relationship building. And it also took us being bold in our asks of the state. Hey, yeah, listen, no, you can't come to the circles. No. Hey, actually, no, you can't. We're not going to report to you about what happened. No, we're not going to do that. Hey, actually, no, you can't use what happens in the circles against young people in other cases. No, you can't do that. And so we had to do some contracting with the state to set up protections for the young people, right? That's a part of it. And that took 2 years to get to. Lots of hard conversations, lots of folks from the state with puffed up chests and upset, and then us having to take a breath and come back 3 months later to the table and say, hey, do we want to do right by these young people or not? Okay, let's open this contract back up. Okay. And so this is what it takes. I think state actors are also people, y'all. State actors are people. Judges, DAs, these are human beings. These are people. And so one thing that I learned in our work with S.O.U.L Sisters and getting the diversion program ultimately agreed to on a 5-year contract with a contract we were happy with, is that we had to build a relationship with the state attorney, people, the humans that work in the state attorney's office, to learn about them, to sit with them, to learn their stories and their motivations and why are you here doing this work with these young people? What do you hope to achieve? That those conversations were incredibly helpful when we needed to push them and prod them and be bold and get them to agree to the stuff that we needed them to agree to. So I think that's also something to consider for those of you who are listening to this, who are thinking about advocacy and how do we get this to happen. These are people. We have to see each other as people. It's important. And let me just see if there's anything else here. No, I think that's it for me for now. This is just so rich.
Woo, you guys, this is medicine. I'm so grateful to you all. I feel like I'm chewing on so much. The poverty of the imagination and the just all rivers lead to the ocean, and also just our fear of making mistakes. So I feel like those really resonate with me. And so I think now I'll turn to you, Jennifer, sort of building off all of these questions. When we think about the difference between reformist reforms that serve to legitimize the system versus reforms that are in service of abolition, I feel like a key difference that we're told often is that we need to make sure that we're not leaving anybody behind, and that whatever we're doing, we're not closing the door on someone else getting this opportunity. And so when thinking about RJ programs being implemented explicitly for young people, can you talk about the ways that this work is being done or can be done that still leaves the door open for adults or for more serious harms? Or do you feel like this work can be done in that way?
Oh, I 100% think it not only can, it must be done in that way. And I think I want to pick up where Ms. Douglas left off, which I felt like, stopping with an amen and please say more. Because I think if we don't take seriously, there's the wisdom that you just heard on the panel, right? Which is, where does the real work of transformation get done? It gets done in those places and spaces of relationship that are disorienting people, that are challenging the system, but not the people in the system, in the sense that you need to create some obligation, some sense of their pathways to be either get out of the way of change or actually be part of it, right? So how valuable, right? Those 2 years or 3 years of getting that pathway of justice negotiated is actually the transformative work of the system, right? It is inviting building the kind of understanding, the kind of commitment, the kind of relationship, the kind of destabilization for the system. And so I think in terms of your question about, what do we want to be attentive to and really careful about if we care about justice transformation, is resisting the very kind of, Ghani, I was listening to you say, we get the sort of definition of restorative justice. And I think that's one of the places and spaces I think we should push back on, right? If restorative justice is actually, and for me, this is how I come at it, a relational approach to justice that focuses our attention on justice, the content of justice being just relations, then it can't be about a return or in service of the current system. It can't be only at individual and interpersonal levels. It must absolutely look at the harms and the healing needed there. But it must require us to look at, how did we get here? What's structuring these relationships? If we put people in rooms and we require them to almost fit the sort of terms and conditions of what the harm is or what the injustice is as the current system, we almost make them complicit in these processes, right? That are actually not looking at collective responsibility, at the system, not only the system's responsibility, but the community's responsibility, right? And so this kind of overly simplistic programs and practices and descriptions of restorative justice as, you know, the victim, the offender, and the community in the room, with the community there to kind of hold the moral majority and wag the finger, rather than to both be supportive and demanding of the kind of a structural and systemic change that needs to come from seeing what's going on in these relationships where harm is caused, right? And so I kind of want to push back on that idea on how we educate people about what restorative justice is, so that it doesn't wind up being these narrow moments. Youth justice is this perfect place and space to do that, because people are more willing there to look at their collective responsibility, right? The community's role in these, on some level, being our children, right? Being of and within the community, that they are the care and concern responsibility of a whole range of people and systems. And if we can destabilize the system enough to think about what justice has to look like, what it requires, who it requires, what it requires of all of us in terms of those structures and those changes and all those questions that have been placed before us today, then it's an easier step to say to people, why is that not true of the big kids, right? Why is that? Why would we draw false limits on whether it's about the trivial crimes and not the more significant ones, about the questions it has to pose to us about why we define some things as crimes and other things as not, about if it's really in our collective responsibility and interest. And then having to ask the question about, when does that shift in terms of our relationship with one another, the collective responsibility for what structures the relationships between and among us. And in Nova Scotia, sort of one example, we've seen that because we approached it not just as an alternative to get the work of the criminal justice system done, but as an alternative justice pathway, we started to bring people into these processes that made assumptions that this is what justice should look and feel like when we have harms. And so the translation to adults was way easier in some sense, because we all started to feel how shallow and what was missing in then justice processes that didn't demand that kind of broader systemic and structural lens and collective responsibility.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much. And so for, I guess, the last, 10, 15 minutes before we turn to Q&A, this question is for any or all of you. And so I feel like in the spirit of this being a law school panel, it feels really important to name that, and Ghani, you alluded to this earlier, just like in academia, there's, we never really get the full picture of what's actually going on the ground. And there's so much money and there's so much power in academia. And so I think people are eager to find ways to like weaponize that power to be more in service of this work. And so, in that vein, can you all share with us like what feels the most alive in the work right now? Like what is something that we're missing? Like what do you feel like is something that we should know about or know more about that we don't? And whoever wants to start can just jump right in.
I might go just here in Aotearoa. We're very focused on whānau or family having the right to choose themselves what their pathway looks like, and we use our model called whānau ora. So, and this includes rangatahi, so youth. So we don't look at the rangatahi or the youth outside of the context of what whānau or family could look like. And I'm not talking nuclear families, I'm talking the wider context of what their community family might look like. And I'm just picking up on some of the talk that's already been there, come out already around collective responsibilities and obligations. So when we are working with organisations or agencies, the government agencies like Oranga Tamariki, which is like Child, Youth and Family, very much so we are come with us or get out of the way, because this isn't going to happen if you keep changing the goalposts and understanding what that looks like for our rangatahi and their family, we will advocate for families and for rangatahi all the time. But they have the right to choose what that pathway looks like for them. So even if a court mandate comes down or they've been mandated to, they must go and follow this particular pathway. If that's not right for them, then why would we make them do it? Because that's just setting them up to fail. And it makes that's part of that wider restorative practice that we're looking at in terms of Indigenous people. It's not just righting the wrong or addressing what's happened in terms of maybe a crime they've committed, but what's happening in that family that we can support the change moving forward. And that whānau and that family and that rangatahi must have the opportunity to choose and tell us what will work for them. And sometimes they don't know what will work for them, but they have the answers. It's our job to help them find that. It's not our job to tell them, you must go and say sorry to this person. If you don't, it's going to be worse for you. We have to figure out, okay, well, we know that this is what they've said that has to happen. There has to be a group meeting, whatever. But how do we make that happen? Or how do we support that to happen in a way that this rangatahi or the family isn't going to feel worse than when they came into the system? So that's part of the wider restorative practice. And I think you talked about that, Ghani, you touched on that a little bit earlier on, is around, it's not our job, you're right, Jennifer, to follow the system. We have to bring them along with us. Wakumi, you're absolutely right. They are people, but they also, as people, they need to understand, work with us or move over, because what has been happening here in this country for over 180 years is not working. So if we keep doing the same thing, we're going to keep getting the same outcome. And that's the part of the restorative practice that I enjoy working in, or that I'm most passionate about, is kind of working in that system change, really making sure that whānau are able, and family and rangatahi are able to choose their path, help steer their pathway, not be told there's only one pathway for you and it's straight from youth residence to adult prison. That's not the pathway. That's the pathway that's been designed for them by people who aren't listening to them. So just wanted to pick up on that.
Real quick, before you wrap, close out, Iri, did you translate for us the greeting that you opened up with? Did you ever translate that for us?
Yeah.
And if it's not too much to ask, can you? Because
it was a very short version of what I would normally do, but usually I would acknowledge what I was saying was where I'm from. Hello, greetings to you all, the tribes that I'm from. And usually we would talk about the mountains that we belong to and the rivers or the oceans that we belong to. So I'm no ko Tarawera ko Taranaki Oku Maunga. Those are my mountains, Tarawera and Taranaki. So I'm from both sides of both coasts of the North Island. And also Tarawera Te Awa, that's one of the rivers that I belong to, and one of the lakes as well. So that's how we would usually introduce ourselves, so that other Māori know where we're from, can figure out whether we're friend or foe. And also if we're related. Yeah.
I'm so happy that I thought to ask you that, because, speaking about the mountains that you're from and the lakes and the seas and so on and so forth, it resonates with me, especially at this time when I'm starting to really consider the role that nature has to play in our justice model, or a restorative or transformative justice model. That nature, it's important that we see nature as a character in our justice process, right? For instance, in one of our cases, we had a youth. We got connected with an organization called Gateway Horseworks, and they run a horse farm. and they use their horses for trauma treatment or for treatment with people with mental health issues. And we know that horses are like magical with, you know, people on the spectrum and so on and so forth. And so we just started talking with them and thinking about, you know, can there be some kind of collaboration, you know, with our diversion program? You know, maybe we can have our young people come up to the farm and interact with the horses. And we were thinking about that, and maybe it can even be part of our restorative plan for a young person. Light bulbs started going off. Yeah, maybe, okay, these two horses don't get along, and this young person have to spend however amount of weeks or months helping these two horses to get along. You know what I'm saying? And especially if the reason they were referred to us was because of some conflict they had with another human being. Now they have to tap into something in themselves to try to get two other creatures to get along, and so on and so forth. And so sure enough, we brought one of our young people up to the farm. And this was a young person who had a very hard time talking or expressing herself. It was beyond reticence. It was like something she had trouble expressing herself and interacting and stuff. Serious battles with depression and needed a lot of support. But when she got up there on this farm with these horses, totally different person. It was like something just opened up in her, you know what I'm saying? She was the most interactive with the horses, was very expressive. And so, you know, just incorporating nature into our justice process may be something that we have to consider. Think about the Gacaca courts of post-genocide Rwanda, right? And the term Gacaca literally means justice in the grass, justice in the grass. And so, you know, going back to what Iri just said, you know, our justice processes. And so this is the work, this is again, one of the intersections between restorative justice or transformative justice and abolition. We are engaged in the work of liberating justice, because right now justice is held hostage in these concrete buildings called city halls and criminal justice centers and juvenile courts. They have justice, the very concept of justice is held hostage in these buildings. And we go to them only when we commit trespasses against each other to have justice rationed out to us, all right? In usually only one way, in very structurally violent ways, you know what I'm saying? And so we're engaged in the process of bringing justice out of these spaces, out into the open world, right? And having the open world, the trees, the grass, the horses, everything be a part of our process of healing, right? In the lives of our young people. And so it might sound philosophical, but we're watching it work, y'all. And it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I resonate with what you're saying, Ghani. We introduce young people to herbs and plant-based medicines in our work, and just essential oils and things like that that seem really like innocuous, things that we might maybe take for granted. But young people connect very deeply to these tools, and it really helps to bring them forward and bring them in, really bring them in the room and help them to open up. There are two things on your question, Jenny, that I wanted to speak to. One is, one of the things that we witnessed at S.O.U.L Sisters during the pandemic was young people using restorative practices to address family conflict and friend conflict in their homes where they were more because they were quarantining, to prevent state involvement. We had numerous stories of young people who intervened in their neighborhood and set up ad hoc processes just to prevent people from calling police or CPS or whatever when a young woman was beefing with her mom, and one of our young women found out, you know, numerous young people went and facilitated processes that they didn't call it that. They were just using the skills and tools that they learned through S.O.U.L Sisters work, through their work with us to do things like just grassroots in their hoods. And so I just want to name, like, one of the things that's percolating and has been percolating for me and for us has been like, just how do we support and how do we make sure that young people aren't just receivers of this information and of these sort of processes, but also that we are cultivating their gifts and skills so that they can move these tools forward, and so that it can penetrate more fully into their communities, our communities, because young people have a lot of power in that way. And then the other thing that comes up for me is just thinking about people behind the walls and the powerful work that is happening. One of our staff and a person that's a dear friend of mine talked about when they became aware of this term restorative justice. They're like, oh, I was doing when I was locked up for 5 years, I was doing circles. We didn't call it all of this. We didn't have all of these words and like all of this manuals and whatnot, but we were doing this. And so I just have been thinking a lot about that like people, and to your point, Ghani, you mentioned this also, that people do this behind the walls and are engaging in this sort of relational way of telling stories, taking account to how they got to be in prison, all of these sorts of things. And that's very powerful. And how can we continue to cultivate and nurture those sorts of, again, like grassroots, like just people-powered interventions that are happening that aren't programmed or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, and I think for me, just as we go to questions, one of the other things I've been thinking about a lot is law students and lawyers. So as happens sometimes in the fall, I wind up in rooms with very keen, very able, very excited young law students who come up and ask how they can do restorative justice stuff, because I'm that person who hangs around the faculty who most of my colleagues half tolerate, but aren't sure why I'm there sometimes, because I think they're not entirely certain that I actually belong in a law school. And to be frank, nor am I all the time. But it's nice to be an interloper. But I find myself more regularly wanting to say to them, do your job restoratively. Like, it isn't the case that what we need is only lawyers and law students and lawyers and those who aspire to be lawyers to add to their roster of skills, or to step out of that and become restorative justice facilitators or community-based facilitators. Some of them came to law school because they were already that, and they should of course return to being powerful voices for that in their community. But others, we don't want to do what law did to ADR, which is sort of colonize it and capture it as another kind of tool in the list of lawyers. Rather, I'd rather them go into, if they're going to be government lawyers and sitting opposite you negotiating those contracts, I'd rather them be thinking about how they can, or to Iri's point, get out of the way, or be allies of helping government figure out how to work differently, rather than, I grieve for the fact that I send lots of law students out into the world and I give them, I guess, an erroneous view of what it might mean to be a lawyer in the public interest, because then they get into government and they become fairly overly paid risk managers who are there to say no, or are there to guard, or are there to keep their client, sort of give instructions rather than take instructions or give advice. But for those who go into that and can think about what does it mean to be an advocate of restorative justice, of justice transformation in those systems, they can be extremely powerful to give government permission, right? To help them figure out how they could be less transactional, less worried only about liability and risk, more worried about the risk of failing the very people they're meant to serve. And so I guess some of the energy and space I have is in thinking about the support that lawyers need to be better and different and get out of the way, or be allies in this work in all of the places and spaces that they are. And I think about that, for example, some of the most recent kind of energy and example around really creative use of class action claims to address institutional, systemic, historical, wide-based harms and abusing, and look for them to be catalysts of social change, and to think about where I work lots with former students and lawyers and others who come and recognize the limits of the current legal system, and look for these kind of really creative justice spaces, whether that's in the resolution of the Home for Colored Children class action, or the current response to erroneous hair testing in our country that took away tons of kids from their parents, and where the justice solutions really have to be about centering first voice, or whether that's residential schools. That those have been there have been lots of lawyers who stood in the way of that, but there were always some key lawyers who could listen to and be allied to first voice, to knowledge holders, to community, and I think we need to figure out, what does that lawyer identity look like? How can we churn more of those folks out and help them protect themselves as wanting to do that work in all the places, spaces that they are?
Thank you all so much. And so in our last 8 minutes, there are 2 really beautiful questions in the chat that I'm going to ask you all to answer. In this short amount of time, I wish that this conversation could continue for a whole other hour. But so the first question is, in your work, how do you hold the rage folks who have been harmed may feel? How do you address and make room for the rage while guiding a restorative process without gaslighting folks who may want revenge or want the criminal legal system to harm the person who harmed them? And then I'll just tell you the second question, and you can just try and incorporate both if you want to. The next question is, how do you define the idea of justice? So whoever feels called.
Well, I'll share. I'm sure that practitioners on this panel have thoughts about the rage piece. My experience with that and working particularly with survivors of sexual violence is to sit with what's under the rage, and like what's the rage really, and to sit and hold space. What I've experienced in the process, and sometimes that takes more than one. That again, time. The other thing that's so like time. We have these. When we were negotiating with the state, they're like, well, the process needs to be over in 6 months. And we're like, well, listen here, okay, we're gonna do what we do. You're gonna stop with this, okay? But yeah, just to sit with folks. And the more we sit and the more we reflect back and the more we ask like heartfelt questions, and create opportunities for folks to reflect, what I have found in my experience comes up is, and I'm gonna say a second thing too. What I found comes up is, where's the hurt really, and how typically harming the other person doesn't actually resolve the hurt, where the hurt really is. That's ultimately where we arrive. What I do where I've arrived with folks in my experience, in my practice. What I will share though is that that I like to share when I train people in restorative justice, that there's no restorative justice utopia, that there is like, that's not real. So like this, like we're not gonna like use restorative justice and hold hands and heal the world tomorrow. We're not gonna do that, y'all, okay? So like things can get messy, and sometimes we don't actually have a neat, tidy solution. Sometimes we just are enraged, and that's where we have met the RJ process, and that's where we remain. And then it's on us to, like Iri was saying, be with people about where do we go from the place where they authentically and really are. And sometimes it's not always like the cutest and the most pleasant and the most kumbaya, right? So wanting to name that also.
In our last 5 minutes, if folks, yeah, okay, cool, Ghani, great.
Just to add this, and we also have at our first restorative community conference, we had a community member who had a rage room, right? And because we do want to affirm, we don't want to dismiss or delegitimize people's feelings, their natural feelings. We don't want to say, well, you turn your rage off. You know what I'm saying? No matter how we try to explain it, why they should, the rage is a natural feeling, it's how you channel it. right? And so one of our community members had a rage room where we give young people or anybody sledgehammers and baseballs, and they can go in there and they can take it out on a car, you know. And we had a room where, of course, the cars are just like, you know, debilitated cars and stuff like that. But we had one situation where young people went in the room and just tore the car up, you know, and yeah, they feel better. You know, we have to become creative in how we ask people to channel their emotions, you know, channel it creatively, channel it through writing, you know, or whatever.
Yep, I'm in total agreement with both Wakumi and Ghani, and sometimes you just have to let them rage. Yeah, and because nothing can be restored if they're still holding on to any of that rage. So you just have, and that may be uncomfortable for the RJ world here in Aotearoa, that it's not going to be this peaceful coming together and everyone's going to want to be, you know, good with each other afterwards. But sometimes, and you know, you can let that happen before they get together, you know, but it doesn't have to happen when they see each other. But you just have to acknowledge and let them do it. I can't think of anything worse, just, you know, thinking about myself when I've got rage. You know, I need to let it out. So, you know, people are people and we've got to let that happen.
I'm struck by how all of us are working from an assumption that maybe we should just say out loud, which is that you can't think of these as these sort of encounter processes or moments, or these are processes. So the other thing that I'm hearing from all of you is there's place and space and time for this to work itself out. I mean, I was laughing about that. It's 6 months. What's 6 months? Like, you can't even go to court in 6 months, but you think you're going to court, you're tying a bow in it and it's all over, rather than it being a journey. Like, there might be multiple sessions, or there might be a lot of working with horses. There might be a lot of onboarding. And so in that, how would we imagine that there's not space for meeting people where they are, understanding the range of emotions, and that it might not just come up once? Or there seems to be a lot of, we've done a disservice in the restorative justice world, I think, to lead people to capture the moment that feels good and looks good, or that they can understand, or that is like it looks like court, but it's in a circle, rather than having them say, like, those encounter moments that you see have an awful lot before, and they better have an awful lot after, if they're actually going to do this kind of transformative justice work. And I think that gets missed and lost, and in partly in our bid to kind of explain it and have people access it or believe it or not squish it. But I think if we surface that, questions like this, it's not a one-off moment where you ought not to be expecting to deal with a whole range of emotions if you're really going to do this work.
Oh, did you want to say one last word?
Yeah, because Jenny just lit some stuff in a fuse in my head. So, you know, at our first restorative community conference, you know, we were like, already, you know, we were threading this line because things had gotten so emotionally charged, you know, and it gets so unpredictable, you know, that you're now threading this line of wanting to run to your manual and wanting to throw your manual in the trash. You know what I'm saying? Because there's no manual for this. There's no real manual for this. You know what I mean? And this is, but that's the beauty of this process, because through this process, you meet out to everyone their individual humanity. This is a process that's responsive and co-responsive, right? It corresponds to the unique needs of every individual and every individual situation. You understand what I'm saying? And so, yeah, there's no script. You know, there's no script to this. You know, because then what happens is then we run the risk of becoming dogmatic with this. You know, and that's how the system functions. The system functions in a straitjacketed way. You know what I mean? And this is a very free process. And so you don't know what you might need. You might need, you know, the horses in this situation, the rage room in that situation, or, we took some young people out to race go-karts, you know what I'm saying, to do some fun stuff, you know what I mean, as part of building relationships and trust and so on and so forth. And so this is a real program. It's a program that's about, that's kind of like rooted in the African proverb, not the one we hear all the time, which is true, about it takes a village. This is the other one that we don't quote enough, that we need to think about more. And that is, when a child is not embraced by the village, he or she will burn it down to feel its warmth. And that's what's happening in our communities, right? When a child is not embraced by the village, he or she will burn it down to feel its warmth. And so through this process, we're about creating spaces that allows every child to feel embraced and every family to feel embraced in a unique way.
I'm so glad that you were able to get that last, word in. I can't even thank you all enough. I feel so nourished, and I wish that this could continue for so much longer, but thank you so much for giving us all so much to chew on and to really reflect and sit with when we think about restorative justice, especially situated in the legal system. And to everyone else who's tuning in, don't forget to sign up for Wednesday, November 10th, the last webinar of this series. And thank you all so much for coming. Have a great day.